All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live discussion. I am Megan Phillips with Jody Ambrose, and we are the co-founders of the nonprofit Train with Trust project. We are dedicated to making animal behavior education accessible to everyone and promoting the use of evidence-based animal care practices. And of course, we are joined today by Dr. Sue Dyson, world-renowned equine orthopedist and researcher. And we are going to be discussing today a very complicated topic, social license to ride, also sometimes referred to as social license to operate. And we wanted to just dive right into this. First, what does social license mean? Well, social license refers to an unwritten agreement between the public and those who ride horses that what we do and the way we do it is okay. It can be referring to social license can refer to the goings on in other fields besides riding, but that's what we'll be discussing today. And this concept of social license, why does it matter? Well, it matters primarily because it has to do with horse welfare, which is important to all of us. And so it's especially helpful to be having this conversation in the context of the 24 behaviors and the ridden horse pain ethogram with Dr. Sue, as the ridden horse pain ethogram provides a very valuable tool for evidence-based assessment of horse welfare. So secondly, social license, and this conversation about the social license to ride is important because it is a fact that the way others outside of the horse world perceive horse welfare can and will impact those who like to ride and enjoy riding, whether in horse sports or recreationally for leisure riding. So for all of us who are interested in horse recreation, horse riding, as well as horse welfare, it's important that we work together to make decisions as a group rather than simply arguing or debating in ways that are unproductive, so that we can lead the conversation about social license to ride from a standpoint of knowing that we're all on board, doing our level best to ensure horse welfare. So today we really want to take a look at about how we can communicate with each other, how we can come to common understandings, common goals, and keeping the welfare of horses always as the central principle. We thought that it would be perhaps insightful for me to start off our conversation just giving a little bit of input from my background and perspective, working in the fields of zoo and aquarium facilities. So zoos and aquariums have faced challenges in terms of social license and public opinion, and they've had great successes and also some failures in regard to that. It seems, as I sort of take a long view and to sort of keep the conversation brief and focused on what is relevant to this current conversation in the horse world, zoos have responded to changing public opinion in ways that have been superficial and therefore were not accepted because they really didn't create advancements in animal welfare. So I'm thinking about the early days when I was younger in the 70s and 80s, when zoos went from just housing and showcasing animals, and they perceived some public pressure, and so just sort of put a fresh coat of paint on things, trying to make an inadequate hyena or lion exhibit have the walls painted like the African Serengeti, and it didn't make any improvements to animal welfare, and therefore it did not translate into any improvement in social license or public opinion. On the other hand, zoos pretty quickly at the same time started making real dramatic, expensive, and investing time, energy, and money into making exhibits that more adequately reflected animal habitats and what those animals really needed in order to thrive and be mentally and physically happy and healthy. And those did see an improvement in social license and public opinion. At the same time, in the 90s, when I started working in zoos, there were really dramatic changes going on in building animal welfare in terms of their mental and behavioral health. And those are ongoing. And zoos and aquariums have really led the field in terms of developing philosophy, techniques, skills, and self-regulation around animal welfare that far exceeds a lot of what is done with domestic animals. But what was not done as well was communicating that and making that as visible as possible to all in the public who were invested in animal welfare. So maybe zoo members or some people saw that, but not everyone. And that has been a shortcoming that has really had some repercussions for the social license, the perceived welfare of animals in zoos and public opinion. So I think that there are lessons to be learned from the zoo and aquarium fields who are full of people who care very deeply about animals and who have made amazing improvements in animal welfare. But somehow there are still some problems with social license and public opinion, and there's a lot to be learned from that. So with putting that as sort of a setting around this conversation, I'm going to turn it over to Jody and talk about what's going on in the horse world with social license a little bit.
So thanks, Megan. That was great. So there's been an ongoing shift and an ongoing conversation around these sort of topics. I think we didn't always use the terminology, but as far back as I can remember, there's been discussion about particularly horse sports in the Olympics, and welfare of working horses. And there's been a couple of factors that have really sort of pushed this conversation into the forefront. And one of those things is a shift towards urbanization. So as people have moved away from the country, away from farming, more towards the cities, there has been a shift in looking at horses more towards seeing them as companion animals and recreational tools, as so to speak, not necessary, and also not necessarily in a way that we ignore their inner emotional life. It's happened as well with dogs. Dogs have always been companion animals, but the same shift has happened in the dog training industry, with working towards using more humane methods and management that's better for the animal, because we are seeing them more as part of our family, more as beings that deserve better treatment. And the other thing that's really pushed this topic to the forefront is the exposure that a lot of practices are getting in the media, in social media. Information has been globalized, so we're seeing what people are doing in other countries, whether it's better or worse than what we feel we're doing. That's one of the interesting things about what the work that we're doing is we work with Dr. Dyson, who's in the UK, we're in the US, but we also work with World Horse Welfare, who's working all over the world. We have associated with a group called IEGC, which is a consortium of governing bodies from different countries. And so we're getting a lot more input from people who do things differently than we do, and we're also seeing it. It's being shown in ways that are accessible, and it's the bad stuff is in front of our eyes. We can't ignore it, and also the good stuff is more accessible than it's ever been before. So we need to discuss what we feel is bad, what we object to, in order to address it. But we need to always keep not just the welfare of the horse in mind, but also who it is that we're engaging with. And both Dr. Dyson and I come from a sort of dual perspective of being welfare advocates and also being competitors. And actually, we also both make our living in the horse industry. So we have a lot of incentives. Some of them may be seen as conflicting, but I think that's sort of the point, is that everyone that's involved in this comes to it with some things that we have as common ground and some differences. And what I am put off by when I am online looking at these conversations is that the temptation to caricaturize the people who disagree with us is extreme. And I was reading last night, the FEI has a commission on equine welfare, and some of the people on that board are some of the people that have made some of the biggest advances in equine welfare that I can remember. There's people from World Horse Welfare. There's someone from World Horse Welfare. There are scientists and researchers. There are good trainers. So when we refer to a group like the FEI, it's not a monolithic opponent. It's people that have shared values and that care about good equine welfare. And we need to figure out how we can work with them rather than working against them. And we wanted to show a graphic that World Horse Welfare has published. Do you have that, Megan?
I do. Let me just get that pulled up.
So Megan and I have made the central tenet of both our for-profit and nonprofit endeavors the word trust. And trust is really important between animals and the people that care for them. It is also important between people. If we don't have relationships with all of the stakeholders and the people outside of the industry, we're only speaking in an echo chamber. We're not talking to anybody who has any control to change anything, because we're already doing what we think we should be doing. We need to be able to communicate with people that might be able to improve. And so to build that trust, we really like this graphic that they came up with, because it demonstrates that it's not any one thing that we should be doing differently. We need to one of the big things we need to do is have transparency, show that if we are doing better, that people see it, that we're not, as Megan was saying, if you make changes and you don't show people that you're making changes, then it loses the impact that it could be having. Shared values, like I just said, finding those places where we agree on things, where we can take steps, constructive steps towards doing better. We love working with Dr. Dyson because she has a long history of doing good work, doing great research, building assessment tools, speaking to people all over the world about these topics. And that gives her legitimacy. And we need to not just expect the people with her sort of legitimacy and competence and credibility to do all the work. We need to reach out to them. We need to build relationships with them. We need to give them a platform as much as possible. And we need to have the confidence that what we're doing is what's best, and not feel like we are alone in the wilderness doing something that nobody else believes in. Because if we build a coalition, if we talk to other people, we realize that we have the potential to have a whole community of people. And I think there are communities of people that can work together, that give people the strength that if they speak out, they'll have support, and that if they need help, they will have somebody to turn to. So all of these pieces come together and have the potential to build trust among the stakeholders in this conversation and between the stakeholders and the people outside, the general public that are looking in. And if we are not doing these things, if we are speaking out of turn when we don't know what we're talking about, or if we are hiding what we're doing, saying one thing, doing another, if we are fighting and not finding those shared values, that negative outcome from those things doesn't just affect the other side. Anything that affects the people we disagree with in the horse industry is necessarily going to affect us when it comes to social license, because it will damage the relationship we have with the outside public, and restrict and regulate some of the things that we're allowed to do that we want to be able to do. So having said all that, I want to bring up with Dr. Dyson and bring her into the conversation. There are so many different topics that we could talk about on this subject. There's a lot of discourse online and in the media and between people in person. But one that's come up really fairly recently that has been talked about at length is the FEI and whether or not double bridles in upper level dressage might be made optional. Currently, they are mandatory. You must ride with a double bridle at the FEI level. And Dr. Dyson, I know you have been in communication with the FEI. Would you like to talk a little bit? First, if you could tell us a little bit about the evidence that has been gathered on this subject, and then if you could talk about what you have been trying to do.
I'll just take a little step back and say that the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission is an independent body which advises the FEI. And they, earlier this year, made the recommendation to the FEI that in their scientific opinion, that there should be an option for the use of a snaffle bridle versus a double bridle. And then subsequent to that, each individual national federation is able to put forward proposals to the FEI for rule changes. And both Sweden and the Dutch Federation put forward a proposal to the FEI that there should be the option at Grand Prix level to use a snaffle bridle if wanted. Now, along at the same time, there was a lot of social media chat. There was riders forums, trainers forums putting forward various arguments for and against, some of which had some validity and some which, to my view, were completely spurious. The FEI decided that they would not change the rules, and I'm going to read what they said. The FEI Dressage Technical Committee has unanimous understanding that the use of a snaffle or double bridle is a technical or sport matter and not a matter of well-being or welfare. We understand the topic of social perception, but from the results of the online survey that were made available to this committee, we could not find scientific evidence nor unquestionable data that allow us to reach to a different conclusion at this moment. And they propose that there should be a multidisciplinary approach to a research project, but I'm not aware of anything that has happened as a result of that, nor is Natalie Warren, who is chairman of the Ethics and Wellbeing Commission. I felt that there was some evidence which questions whether or not we should be making all horses wear double bridles. So to start with, there is a very nice study which has looked at the dimensions of the oral cavity or the mouth of horses, which has shown that the dimensions of the oral cavity vary hugely among horses, and that is not directly related to the outside measurements of the horse. So you could have a horse which has got a relatively large head, but a small mouth. So it is pretty obvious from that that some horses are going to find it difficult to accommodate two bits within their mouths. as part of the ridden horse pain ethogram, one of the 24 behaviors is mouth opening with separation of the teeth for at least 10 seconds. And we have shown that that behavior is at least 10 times more likely to be seen in a horse with musculoskeletal pain than a horse without musculoskeletal pain. But obviously there are other potential reasons for mouth opening, such as oral discomfort. The horse might be the bit or the bits, it might be buccal ulceration, it could be lacerations of the corner of the mouth, there could be umpteen reasons, or the effect of the rider and their use of the rein aids, and therefore the influence of the bit and pressure in the horse's mouth. Well, we have applied the ridden horse pain ethogram to horses in the competition scenario. So we have done studies looking at Grand Prix dressage horses at elite level, World Cup level, at sub-elite level, and we've also looked at event horses at 5-star level and at the lower level of eventing in the United Kingdom. And we have data on approximately 1,600 horses during either the competition itself or during warm-up for competition. And our results show an incredible variability in the presence of mouth opening. So at the lower level of eventing, the frequency of mouth opening with separation of the teeth for at least 10 seconds was only 35% of the horses, whereas at 5-star 3-day event level, it was 44%. And the majority of 5-star horses compete only with snaffle bridles. However, at World Cup Elite Grand Prix dressage, the frequency of mouth opening was 68%. So that's nearly twice as much as at the lower levels of eventing, despite the fact that the lower levels of eventing, the total ridden horse pain ethogram scores were considerably higher and the incidence of overt lameness was considerably higher, which suggests to me that it's not because these upper level horses are necessarily having musculoskeletal discomfort, it would more relate to something going on within the mouth. And then when we look at the sub-elite Grand Prix horses, we see a staggering 81% of horses having their mouths open with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more, and often repeated throughout the dressage test. So this to me gives fairly compelling evidence. What's the difference between the Grand Prix horses and the other horses we've studied? It's the fact that they've got double bridles in their mouths and they're being used for upper level dressage. We also have data from 150 horses that were undergoing investigation of poor performance. And in those horses, the majority of which were not worked in double bridles, the incidence of mouth opening with separation of the teeth was 52%, and that was reduced to only 12% after we'd removed the musculoskeletal pain. So this suggests to me that we have evidence based on looking at observational studies of a large number of horses, which would indicate that the Grand Prix horses have an unprecedentedly high frequency of occurrence of mouth opening. And the question is, why? Is it because they've got double bridles? Or is it because of the movements they're being asked to do? Or is it because of the rein cues being delivered by the riders? There was a very small Swedish-based study in which they looked at 7 Grand Prix horses being ridden on a treadmill in collected trot. And they were able, using high-speed cinematography, to show that these Grand Prix horses showed a rather rhythmic opening of their mouths in association with a backward movement of the rider's hands. And these horses were also ridden in double bridles. So I think that raises a question: do we have a problem? And we therefore need to be saying, well, there seems to be some fairly strong circumstantial evidence that there may be a problem. And therefore, perhaps we ought to be cautious and say, well, maybe we should be allowing horses to be ridden in snaffle bridles. So I approached the FEI. I wrote a long letter which was somewhat dismissed by them. That I did get a reply in which they indicated, they just really reiterated what had been said in their statements after the rule changes had been dismissed. They didn't say anything extra at all. So I then went back to them and said, to my knowledge, there are no studies ongoing. And in fact, in my opinion, it would be rather difficult to design a study to ask the question from a sufficient number of horses that is there a difference between snaffle bridles and double bridles? Because you would have to take a large number of horses that worked for a period of time in a double bridle and a period of time in a snaffle bridle. And we're talking about days or weeks on end in order to see whether or not there was any difference, and then switch them back to the alternative bridle in order to see if there was any difference. And this would require a large number of horses. It would require ethical approval from a research institution. It would be very costly, and you would need the cooperation of a large number of horses and riders. And obviously there are other factors which would come into account, because the riders may inherently ride differently in double bridles versus snaffle bridles, which creates bias, which is very difficult to remove, because you can't blind the rider to whether or not they've got a snaffle bridle in the horse's mouth or a double bridle in the horse's mouth. So actually, the concept of developing a research project is really rather difficult. And I've talked about this for 2 years with a variety of different people, when after we got all our results, saying, well, could we set up a prospective study? And the basic answer has been it would be extremely difficult to do in a scientifically robust way. So we really need to take heed of the observations that have already been made.
I think this is such a good example of where we can look at how we're approaching this, because what the commission has recommended and what you are talking about is a rule change that would not require anyone to do anything they don't want to do. It would give people the option to do something constructive. And if that was allowed, that could show people that it's possible. It could show that it is better, possibly, if the findings of the information that you've gathered had changed with more horses going in a snaffle. And I think it's a good example of how someone with your competence and legitimacy is not able to have enough influence to make an actual change. And I think that there are a lot of people within the horse industry that have become aware of this issue. They're aware that there is a problem. And the response that I've seen is to criticize not just the FEI, but individuals, individual riders, and sports as a whole are often under fire. And while I understand the emotional impact of seeing horses in distress, there's a few things that you brought up that we are not doing. One is that we are not focusing on the people that are doing things well enough, I feel. Some of the things that you just said about lower level horses, about horses in different disciplines that we're not seeing these problems, those things need to be highlighted so that people that are coming into the sports, just learning that they have something to aspire to, they seek out professionals that are doing things that way, and we build rather than tearing down. You can't stop a behavior unless you replace it with something else. So again, I think this is a good example of you're making the effort to replace something that is problematic with something else in a way that is not going to cause people to shut down. It's not going to cause people to leave the sport, but it's going to perhaps lead to the ultimate goal of improved welfare based on evidence. In terms of the FEI not responding, again, I talked about the FEI not being monolithic. I'm sure there's lots of people within the FEI that are interested in what you have to say. The question I would have is, who do we need to amplify besides you? I think you're a no-brainer. Like, we need to amplify this information, which is what we're trying to do. But who else do you feel should have a seat at this table, have more of a voice? I feel like if we have more of a coalition of people approaching the decision makers, that has potential to make a big difference. But also, maybe we have the opportunity to change who the decision makers are.
Yeah, well, I think there are other people involved in today's Horse and Hound. There is a large article about snaffle bridles, in which it says that the International Society for Equitation Science are advocating change. They strongly believe that for the best welfare interests of the horse, that the snaffle bridle should be an option. And there's also a statement from Rolly Hours from World Horse Welfare enforcing that opinion, that we should be taking the precautionary principle. We do have some evidence that bridles may be influential, and therefore we ought to give the option for change. And if we gave the option for change, it would allow us to gather more information prospectively. Because if we then repeated the study that I've already done in a prospective fashion, we would be able to see whether or not there was less mouth opening with the horses ridden in snaffle bridles versus those ridden in double bridles. We would have to do it on a large enough number of horses to make it statistically valid, but it would give a wonderful opportunity to provide some scientific evidence one way or the other. It may be that we see no change, but we don't know unless we look.
Right. A great shout out to Horse and Hound, because they are doing a great job of amplifying the information. I think there's a few other publications that have done a really good job of putting forth evidence-based information on these topics. And I think it requires greater numbers of people to be learning about
yes,
these.
and I think we have to talk as far as possible with one voice. And this is the problem with the equine community at the moment, that there are completely polarized opinions. So we have some dressage riders and some dressage trainers who are completely opposed to change, because they say that this is the classical way of testing the rideability of the horse at the upper level and the ability of the rider. But to me, that doesn't actually make sense, in that if the horse can perform the movements beautifully in a snaffle bridle, how does that show that the horse is less well trained than the horse that can do it in a double bridle? It doesn't make sense to me. And I just am a little bit concerned that some of the people who are opposed to change are somewhat worried that if we do have a change, that it's part of the slippery slope, when perhaps ultimately double bridles will be eliminated. And then, because we have bred such big, moving, powerful, warm blood dressage horses now, some of those horses, I think, potentially will be more difficult to train without the use of a double bridle, using the, dare I say, the strength that can be enforced through the use of a double bridle, in that you've got a lever arm with the curb, you've got the curb chain, so you're acting differently to a snaffle bridle, which is probably a harsher type of application of a cue than with a snaffle bridle.
Yeah, and that brings up, I think change in all, we always want change to come about in a constructive way by giving people information and opportunity and support to do the right thing. But I think that brings up another powerful incentive, is an economic incentive, that trainers who make a living training horses, breeders who make a living selling big moving horses, even the companies that make some of these bits, there's all kinds of factors where, yes, economics is an incentive to not change, but that is a lever, so to speak, that we as an industry, if we work together, can have the power to change. If the demand for a different kind of riding, a different kind of equipment, a different kind of competitor, if we demonstrate that that is possible and that it is what people who are consumers of these services want,
Yes,
that
and that brings up another issue with respect to the judges, in that
yes,
acceptance of the bit is supposed to be one of the foremost things that the judges should be evaluating. So my question is, do the judges recognize opening of the mouth with separation of the teeth for prolonged periods? And are they penalizing it appropriately? Or have they got too much to watch? And should we be having an additional judge whose job is purely to look at things like harmony and acceptance of the cues? Because we also see in these Grand Prix horses, a lot of horses that are constantly swishing their tails in synchrony with the application of spur cues. Is that acceptable? Should we be allowing that? Should it be penalized more in terms of the overall judging of dressage, which should surely reward harmonious horsemanship? And the mouth being opening with separation of the teeth does not, to me, reflect harmonious horsemanship. So we need to bring everybody on board, the rule makers, the rule enforcers, the judges, the trainers, the riders, the owners. Everybody needs to be one. And as you say, the people that manufacture the equipment as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I was going to bring up judges as well. And I think that idea of, changing the system in some constructive way so that it's not the judge's responsibility necessarily to be the arbiter of the horse's welfare, because the judge has a lot of responsibility in just judging the basic test. And so the idea of having a separate judge, and then, I, as a Grand Prix dressage competitor, immediately think about, like you said, the slippery slope of if horses are penalized for a swishing tail or ears back or whatever, where does the line get drawn? Because, horses that do Grand Prix dressage are necessarily under stress. And do we feel that that's okay? And so there's all of these issues that need to be, that no one's going to agree on necessarily. Like, we're never going to all agree that, that one way is the way to do it, because there are all of these factors and there are these slippery slopes on both sides, where if we go too far in one direction, we don't get to have horse sports anymore. And if we go too far in the other direction, horse welfare is sacrificed. And
I do think passionately that I want to preserve equine sports.
Same.
But clearly there are some problems within equine sports. And I think that if we collectively were seen to identify some of the problems and on an evidence-based basis, and then propose some change and create that change and publicize that change in a proactive way, then we would be winning lots of brownie points from the public, because we were being seen to change of our own volition rather than waiting to be criticized by others. And I think that's how we win this battle, is by being proactive rather than being reactive.
I agree. And I feel like it's never going to be enough for one person to be proactive. It has to be a united front. Like I said, we're never all going to agree on everything, but if we can use the evidence-based information that people like you are providing, and also recognizing the limitations of what we can know, and like you said, abiding by more of a precautionary principle, that is how we find common ground. And if we don't find that common ground, our influence is undermined. We're not going to be able to change, the judging, the training, the regulation, the production of equipment, the the coverage, the media coverage, all of those things. People are working to change in various ways, but what's not happening is this coalescing of these viewpoints into a united front that can actually have an impact. And the other part is that we have to actually be doing these things ourselves. Like we have to be doing better and showing it. Like Megan said, it's not enough to make these changes and not let anyone know. We need to walk the walk. We need to have transparency, and we need to work together. And those are really the pieces of having a social impact and showing the public, building that trust that they actually, I think doing those things is more important than actually being perfect in the image of, in the eye of the public. And actually, I want to talk about a couple other topics that have a little bit more to do with the general public, because I think the double bridle debate is very much happening within the industry, and does have some effect on social license. But there are some things that are even more sort of out there. I think horse racing is a big one that a lot of people outside the industry are somewhat aware of the issues. It's a topic we could do a whole day full of conversation about. But I did want to talk about an area where there have been some changes. I know here in California, they have done some, I think within the last couple of years, regulated the use of a whip. Again, not necessarily gone all the way to what I would, as a horse welfare advocate, want to see, but there have been changes made. I think a lot of that is based on optics with the public. That's probably the driving force. It is an instance where things can be changed by public pressure, by criticism, but again, making constructive changes, replacing what is happening with something else. I know that you have talked about the issue of whip use in other countries. Can you talk a little bit about that conversation?
Yes, I think in most countries, the structure of whips has been changed substantially so that they are effectively much less harsh if they are applied. In most countries, there is a restriction of the number of times the whip can be used, and that is strictly enforced. But in the Scandinavian countries, they went as far as banning the whip. And that was being opposed in the United Kingdom because the jockeys felt very strongly that they needed a whip in order to steer a horse which wanted to go in a different direction to which they wanted to. So they felt from a safety point of view that they wanted the whip in order to be able to facilitate steering. And I would certainly say as a rider, I have tended to go along with that. But then the Scandinavian countries have produced data provided by the jockeys, which have shown that since the banning of the whip, there have not been any more accidents as a result of horses veering off course. And the jockeys are in fact relatively happy with the status quo being without the whip. And that therefore demonstrates to me that maybe we need to be moving forwards, because there's no doubt that if you watch the finish of a race which is being televised and you see the jockeys constantly waving their arms, not striking the horse necessarily, but waving their arms, it's not a good public perception, I don't think. And we have to be very aware of that.
Yes, I think that, like I said, I think optics have been a driving force in those changes, and it is an example of where having more exposure to the public can actually bring about change. And I think we've seen this in other industries. The dog industry has been grappling with this also for a while, with shock collars and choke chains and other aversive methods. Zoos have been through this conversation with a bunch of different handling methods. And I think probably the thing that has brought about the most positive change is demonstrating that doing it a different way is effective. That we don't necessarily need to do things. The horse world, in my opinion, and I've worked in all these different industries to some extent, the horse industry itself is the most resistant to change, in my opinion, is very tradition based. It's different in different countries, but in most cases, horse training has been happening for a very, very, very long time, and people have been passing down their, customs from generation to generation, and there is a lot of resistance to giving up some of these things.
Yes, but absolutely. But if you see the example of what's happened with top hats for dressage,
right,
and they've gone, you don't see them anymore. Everybody's wearing crash hats. That happened certainly in the UK when Charlotte Dujardin at the 2012 Olympics wore a crash hat. And then there was a sea change. It was suddenly accepted. And now you don't see people wearing top hats at all. And people would think it was very odd. So that does show that something which was incredibly traditional could be changed, but led by the right person, a really high profile person who was at the top of her game, being very, very successful, but nonetheless recognizing that there were potential safety advantages by wearing a crash hat. And I think you had the same thing in the United States with an accident that promoted change.
exactly. Yeah, when Courtney King was injured, I think that was the most influential. That was the inflection point in the US where people who had been resistant to wearing helmets started wearing helmets, and then the rule changes came. But it was not unlike in the UK, because what happened was that it scared even some of the top level riders into changing. And I actually think what you mentioned of people seeing respected, competent people doing something different, that is actually what changed people's minds. I think, and I think fear is a motivator, but fear is also a motivator to stop doing something. It's not necessarily a motivator to start doing something else. And I think that seeing that change in such a entrenched part of the sport was critical. And I think that's really informative when we talk about all these other changes, like who are the people that can be visible and can have that kind of
Yeah,
voice.
absolutely. And Charlotte Dujardin has publicly said she often trained Vallegro in a snaffle bridle.
Mm-hmm.
That's novel. You don't very often hear that. And she and Carl Hester have been very proactive in saying, we turn our horses out. They go out every day. They're not confined in the stable. We think that the welfare of the horse in terms of socialization and exercise, free exercise, is really important. And I think that there we are seeing the potential for change by being led by really notable people in the industry.
Absolutely. Can we shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what happened with the modern pentathlon? I think that's another topic that people outside of horse sports became aware of, and a major policy change happened because of it.
Yes, so we had the situation at the last Olympics when, during the show jumping phase of the modern pentathlon, and riders have to draw which horses they're going to ride, we saw a rider riding a horse which was clearly a difficult horse, and the horse was being very resistant and stopping, and the trainer actively hit the horse. How effective that was is open to question, but it was beamed around the world and received incredible public scrutiny and criticism. And as a result, within weeks, there was a decision made that after Paris 2024, riding will no longer be part of modern pentathlon. And that really highlighted to me how quickly change can come about. And historically, I think the sport of riding within modern pentathlon hasn't been great. I saw what happened in London. It was not a nice spectacle, but this really just brought it to a head. So I think we If we bury our heads in the sand and say, okay, well, we know it's not been very good, but nobody's really worrying about it, eventually it is going to come to a head, particularly with the way that social media has advanced things and how quickly things go around the world in terms of spectacles that are unpleasant, which we should not be condoning.
Yeah, I think that's a great example too, because like you said, that sport had been problematic for a long time, and the information was available to people, and it was not addressed in a constructive way, which could have been requiring those riders to do more training, having those riders ride a horse that they had ridden before. There's all kinds of constructive ways that could have been improved, and it wasn't addressed. It was even people, and again, people spoke out, but they spoke out with individual voices, not as an industry whole. And it got to that critical point where it couldn't be ignored, and the response was that even the people that were not the problem lost the opportunity to participate in the activity. And I think it's a cautionary tale for sure, without being fear mongering and saying, we're going down this slippery slope of eliminating horse sports. Like you said, these things happen quickly. And I know Megan has seen some pretty fast shifts in the zoo and marine mammal industry as well, with some of the public outcry about things that, if decisions had been made differently, could have maybe turned out better for everyone involved, including the animals. So it's definitely worth looking at that and thinking about how things could have gone differently.
Yeah, I would jump in and say that it is so important to have that opportunity to look at and acknowledge areas where things don't look good, but maybe aren't as bad as they look, or don't look good because they aren't good. Have that conversation and be transparent and engage. And as you've said, Dr. Sue, sort of lead that conversation rather than having to react to it. Because there is also the component of misinformation out there. And one aspect that I am aware happened in the zoo and aquarium field was dismissing people's concerns because of the presence of misinformation. And just because the other side doesn't understand, or you perceive the other side, or the outside voices don't have the information that you wish they would have, doesn't mean that you should dismiss that conversation. It's a conversation that needs to be had more than ever. And so that opportunity in these sort of big, high profile cases is one that can be powerful, and powerful for the good if voices are united.
Yeah, absolutely. Along those lines, I want to bring up one more sort of topic that is something that you see people discussing a lot right now, which is nosebands. There's a lot of pictures people are publishing of horses with tight nosebands. There is a lot of education coming to light about the function of nosebands and the detrimental effects of nosebands. Can you talk a little bit about what the evidence actually is? And we can talk a little bit more about the rule changes.
Yes, there's somewhat of a paradox here, because the FEI have accepted that their current rules don't address noseband tightness adequately. So currently, the rules only apply to dressage horses. And then they're using the so-called two-finger rule, the two fingers being applied underneath the noseband at the side of the horse's face, where there's a natural concavity, and not on the front of the nose, where the pressure is actually applied. And it doesn't apply to event horses nor show jumpers. And we see incredibly tight nosebands and multiple nosebands on many show jumpers, but they are apparently ignored. However, the FEI is proposing that there should be a change in nose bands across the disciplines. And they do feel that there is scientific evidence to support that. But actually, when you scrutinize the scientific studies that have been done, they are not of the highest quality. They are based on very small numbers of horses and rather poor experimental designs, in my opinion. So I'm not in any way suggesting that tight nose bands are a good thing, but what I am saying is that, for example, a study which places a double bridle and a tight nose band on a horse, which is a naive horse which has never had a bridle on before, is not a very good experimental design to show the effect of a tight nose band versus a loose nose band, because you're dealing with naive horses which haven't had bits in their mouths before, and you're not only putting a bit in the mouth, you're putting a double bridle in the mouth, plus a tight nose band or a loose nose band, and then looking at the responses on a small number of horses, like less than 10 horses. And that, to me, is not an adequate level of science to support decision making. But paradoxically, for a variety of different reasons, this low level of science has been accepted by the FEI as a reason to institute some changes. And there is a published study in which it's suggested in the discussion that a tight nose band makes the horse more sensitive to rein aids. And then in the next paper you read that this is fact, although it's not a fact. It was a supposition made without evidence to support it. It was a maybe it might make the horse more sensitive to rein aids, but actually there's no scientific validity to show that that is the case. And this is poor science getting perpetuated. So I'm absolutely in favor of controlling the use of over tight nose bands. But at the same time, I think we need to be transparent in what is the quality of the science on which decision making is being made.
Yeah, I mean, that highlights the communication piece, because clearly there was successful communication of a certain amount of information. The question is, what are we amplifying and why? And I guess the case could be made that if it had the effect of driving some sort of change to people riding with a looser noseband, it's not all bad. But if
actually, I don't know if the people that make these decisions understand what is true evidence-based information.
Right.
They see an experiment has been performed. They perceive that as research, whether it's a good experiment or not a good experiment. Is that better than observational studies based on hundreds of horses, which have also undergone a peer review process before they can be published? And this is where I think where there is a dichotomy, a lack of understanding of what represents evidence-based information. And evidence-based information, in my view, doesn't have to necessarily mean an interventional experiment. If you've got enough numbers and the study design is adequate, then observational studies provide hugely important pieces of information.
Yeah, I think that's a piece that is another constructive step, not just educating people about what the science says, but educating people about what the science is. And, what do we know? How do we know it? How can we know more? And what are our limitations to what we can know? And then again, about things like taking a precautionary approach to things, that is a legitimate approach to change. And it's a constructive step that people can support, that people can amplify and advocate for, as opposed to just advocating for things to stop, just advocating for people who are not doing the right thing to get out, to leave, to quit, because it's going to drive those people underground. They're not going to stop. It's not been shown to be an effective driver of behavior change. And if you don't replace it with something else, it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to keep happening. So I think those topics that we just discussed really highlight too how this is not just a dressage problem. This is not just a horse racing problem. These are things that the entire horse industry needs to be concerned with. And again, we tend to be a little bit tribal, I think, about, not just staying in our discipline, but also staying in our culture, staying in our country. We do it better than they do it. Maybe we do this wrong, but we're better than them. And it really is a problem that there's just a vast number of people are affected by, and that we have the ability to work with if we can take these steps that have been shown to have an effect on improving welfare rather than just being reactive. What do you see? I mean, you've talked a lot about evidence and collecting evidence and using it to assess welfare, specifically the ridden horse pain ethogram that you have worked tirelessly to share with people and get people to use. What role do you see that particular assessment tool playing in this conversation?
We can sell the good news. We can say that at World Cup dressage level, Grand Prix level, the most frequent score is only 2 out of 24. So these horses are working comfortably. The same applies at 5-star 3-day event level. The most frequent score is 3 out of 24. So we can be using this information in a very proactive way to say that at those high levels, these horses are comfortable, and that's a win-win situation for everybody. Not so good at the very low levels because the scores are higher and we see more evidence of overt lameness, which means we need to be educating people more at the lower levels. But I think that we need to be selling ourselves and saying at these upper levels, in fact, the majority of horses are very comfortable. And I gather there's been some social media attention about horses the trot ups for eventing competitions and saying these horses have got poor top lines. Well, maybe they've lost the concept of what a fit, lean horse should look like. We've been so used to obesity concealing the normal body contours that when we see a fit, lean athlete, we're missing the plot. But we know those horses, and actual facts, are working comfortably in terms of the vast majority. It's only a small proportion that have high scores at that level.
I would add to that as well that I think what I've seen personally, and I think you've seen this as well, is that horse owners and riders have been using the RHP to drive interest in veterinarians because they're bringing it to their veterinarians and asking them to use it as a tool. And I think that is a great example of how we can drive change, because I think veterinarians understanding the importance of these assessment tools, not just doing things the way they've always done them, but also looking at the horses under saddle is absolutely a critical piece in identifying those problems at the lower levels.
Absolutely. And we could be prospectively monitoring these horses. So if we say it's starting with a ridden horse pain ethogram score of 2, but if it's slowly going up, that is a red flag that something's going wrong. And the sooner we intervene and find out what's going on and rectify that, the better. And that will promote longevity of the sports horse.
Yeah, and I can tell you from personal experience too, it's a great tool for monitoring improvement as well. Is this treatment working? Have we identified the course that will benefit the horse? And is there something more we could be doing? I think it's powerful to use as a tool for veterinarians, but also It's something that owners themselves can use. It's something that body workers can use, and it really empowers people to definitively do something to improve welfare. So yeah, I think it's absolutely a critical piece of this whole conversation, and it's really based on something that we, from a behavior standpoint, feel is really important, which is listening to the horses, seeing the horses as sentient beings that can express themselves, allowing them to express themselves, because the more information they give us, the better we can do for them. And so the two things work hand in hand, having these assessment tools and also looking at things from a little bit more of a holistic perspective, from behavior, and giving horses a little bit more agency, and not just seeing them as victims of these bad practices, but they are participants in the discussion when we allow them to express how they feel. So it's, yeah, I feel very passionate about that. And I know that, that is where your work comes from, is a place of feeling passionate about that as well. So we've gone on for a really long time. Do we have any questions that we want to address?
We haven't had any questions submitting. It looks like I was enjoying watching the conversation, listening to the conversation. So we did have a question that was submitted that we can either answer now or afterwards, from sort of a fellow veterinarian perspective, or we can move on to our wrap up and answer that in writing afterwards, whichever you prefer.
I think probably we should wrap up at this stage.
All right, excellent. So Jody, do you want me to go ahead and share this graphic? Because we wanted to talk a little bit about what we can all do in being constructive as we are promoting being constructive. I'm going to share this graphic then.
So this is also from World Horse Welfare, who have really been leading this conversation. And I highly recommend going to their website and reading everything that they have to say. They have a paper that they commissioned that goes into depth about the topic of social license and what we can learn from what's happened in other industries. But I think this is a nice little summary of the pieces that all need to be in place for us to preserve our social license to operate. We discussed that the welfare of the horse always has to be paramount in our minds, and we can't get bogged down with arguing about whether we're right or defending our ego or our traditions. We really need to be able to look at what the evidence indicates is good welfare, and whether that evidence is as robust as we can make it. And we need to provide a mechanism through which people can act on those things, meaning we need to support people who speak up. We need to give people help rather than cutting them down if they're trying to do better, or if they need to do better, we need to give them a support system, which means working together. Education is a critical piece of what we do with the Train with Trust project. We are trying to make education more accessible to more people, not just to the people that seek it out, not just to the people that have the money to pay for it. It's really important that everyone who has any kind of voice amplifies the evidence-based information and demonstrates through their own actions a better way of doing things. We need to consider the ethics even in the practice of gathering evidence. There are ethics that need to be considered. Just because we want to know something doesn't mean it's ethical to do a study that would definitively determine whether it's true or not. And obviously considering ethics in everything we do is non-negotiable. As Megan talked about, communication both within the industry and to outside interested parties is critical and has the power to make change happen, both the change that we want and the change that we would rather not see, depending on what gets communicated. So we need to be all on the same page and taking action before the communication gets away from us, before the story gets away from us. And we can be proactive. We can have these discussions. We can be open-minded. We can support research both financially and by paying attention to what it tells us and communicating the results. We can lift up the experts that have the legitimacy and the competency that should have a bigger voice. And we should look at what might be a problem down the road and address it before it becomes a problem.
Very good. All right. Well, on that note, I think it's about time for us to wrap up. We did.
Just before you do, I had a few just sort of questions for further thought that I wanted to throw out there. I know we've been going a long time, but I think it's kind of important. I think it's important for all of us who do work with horses, ride horses, love horses, that we consider where we started and how far we've come just individually. Are you doing better than you used to? And what was it that motivated you to change? And also, what advantages did you have that made it possible for you to change that might be holding someone else back? And how can you help someone make changes that might not necessarily have access to the same information or support or just opportunity to do something differently? And then how can we present an image that is welcoming and inviting to people that may just be starting out? Because we may not be able to get everyone who's already in the industry to do things differently, but everybody has to start somewhere. And if we are seen to be rejecting people and angry, and it's easy to get very emotional about these topics, but we need to provide an opportunity for people to step into a new way of doing things from the beginning, and consider how we would feel if we were just starting out, and would we be motivated to follow the practices that we are espousing. And I just think it's good to reflect on those things, because I know for myself, I have not always been in the place I am now, and I also feel like I'm always making progress. It's important to really look inward as well and think about those things.
Such a great point, and so important if we're to have constructive conversation and discourse. So we invite you guys to let us know any thoughts you have on this matter, and also if there are any other topics you'd like us to talk about. Our next topic will be about a bit of a departure from this one, and a little bit more veterinary based than some of our others. Kissing spines, also spoken of medically, as impinging spinous processes. So it's a diagnosis that is out there and gets talked about a lot. So we'll get Dr. Sue's take on that. Also be on the lookout for Dr. Sue Dyson's book that she co-authored with Sue Palmer, Harmonious Horsemanship, Use of the Ridden Horse Ethogram to Optimize Potential, Partnership, and Performance. It has gone to print. It can be pre-ordered and should be, is this still the case, around mid-September as far as you know, Dr. Dyson?
I hope so, yes. It will be available either in book form or as an ebook.
Okay, excellent. Another note that we wanted to shout out is that the film, The 24 Behaviors of the Ridden Horse in Pain, Shifting the Paradigm of How We See Lameness, was invited to and accepted for the Tryon Film Festival in North Carolina. That will be October 6th through 8th. And so Dr. Dyson will be out here doing a talk in the States, in North Carolina, doing a talk along with the showing of that film. And the filmmaker, Catherine Lortzen, will also be present. And so it'll be a great opportunity for some folks to participate in that side of the sharing of this information, the film side of things. So we thank you guys all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next talk in 2 weeks. So let me look at my calendar. That will be September 7th. We will be discussing kissing spines with Dr. Sue Dyson. Thanks so much.